Hey guys, James here, how's it going? So, I decided against making this video a while back, but since Alliance of Demons and Together for Peace made videos about this quite recently, I decided to chime in with my 2 cents, and I think I've got some arguments which I haven't heard on here before, so I'm just going to throw some new ideas out there as well. I am of course referring to shockofgod's question, what proof and evidence do you have that atheism is accurate and correct? So this video is going to be split into 3 sections. Part 1, reiteration of the standard atheist argument. Part 2, atheism is accurate. And Part 3, atheism is correct. Now believe it or not, something can be accurate without it being correct, but more on that later. So Part 1, reiteration of the standard atheist argument. We are not the ones with the burden of proof. Now I honestly can't see why this is such a hard concept to understand. People who believe in God tell us why they believe in God, and then we will tell them why that argument is invalid. That's the way it works, that's the way it always will work. But since people don't seem to understand this, I've decided to put a little metaphor together. Now imagine the following situation. Bob says to Steve that he saw a giant 8-foot rabbit while he is out in the woods. Steve is left with 2 options in regard to this. He can either believe Bob or disbelieve Bob. If he decides to believe Bob, he might say, well, Bob's a trustworthy guy, I'll believe him. Or he could disbelieve Bob. He could think, well, you know, there was that one time when Bob lied before, or perhaps Bob was hallucinating, or perhaps Bob was exaggerating. Either way, it's up to Bob to prove it, not up to Steve to disprove it. Now supposing Steve told Bob that he didn't believe him, and Bob turned round and said, well, okay, we'll prove the rabbit doesn't exist. This would be an invalid argument. Supposing Steve did go to the woods with Bob to try and prove that the rabbit didn't exist, and they went there and searched every cubic foot of the forest and didn't see the rabbit. Bob could then claim, well, the rabbit must have gone somewhere else, or the rabbit's invisible, or he could come up with any number of excuses as to why they didn't find it. But regardless, it's up to Bob to prove that the rabbit exists, not up to Steve to disprove it. I honestly can't see how this is so hard to understand. If a God existed, there would be ample proof and evidence for it. Part 2. Atheism is accurate. Now, yeah, of course, accurate doesn't always mean correct. For example, Newtonian physics. I'm sure there are far better examples out there, but that's the best I could come up with at this time. It's pretty late, but I think it works as an example. Newtonian physics work extremely well at describing the motion of things, solar system size and smaller. However, they completely fall apart when you're dealing with things moving close to the speed of light, or you're dealing with things the size of galaxies. The same could well be true of atheism. Atheism certainly is accurate in regards to earthquakes, floods, lightning, diseases, and movement of celestial bodies. When people have tried to factor God into the equation of these things in the past, then they have become very, very inaccurate. However, atheism certainly is accurate in regard to these things, as there's perfectly logical, natural processes which describe all of these events. Now here's the biggie. Part 3. Atheism is correct. If you aren't shockofgod, please don't take this bit too seriously. I know it's not a valid argument against believing in God, but it is using his own logic against him. An atheist is someone who doesn't believe in any gods, so to prove atheism accurate, we must disprove every single god ever thought up. As much as it might be informative to disprove every single god from Alice's use, this is completely unnecessary. By Shocky Boy's own logic, that being, you should have evidence to prove something doesn't exist, he must already have evidence for the non-existence of every single god except Yahweh, since of course he obviously isn't a hypocrite. This leaves me with the task of disproving Yahweh. Yahweh is supposed to be perfect and the Bible is supposed to be his words. Since Yahweh is apparently perfect, anything falsifiable in the Bible disproves God. There are many things I could choose for this, but I shall use the story of Noah's Ark. Let's forget how hard it must have been for Noah and his family to travel the entire globe gathering 2 of every animal, and let's forget how hard it must have been to make a boat large enough to house 2 of every animal, and let's forget how hard it must have been to look after all of those animals for 40 days. Let's forget about the questionable nature of where quintillions of tons of water came from and where it went. Let's forget the fact that many plants and seeds cannot survive submerged underwater for several months. And let's forget how unlikely it would have been for every other human being in the world to be so evil as for God to feel it necessary to kill all of them. I'm simply going to focus on the fact that the story simply doesn't match species diversity as we see it today. If Noah's Ark was true, then you'd expect to see the most number of species around where Noah's Ark landed. However, what we actually see is much more like this. We only see polar bears in the north and penguins in the south, and we only find marsupials in Australia, and we never find bones of these animals anywhere near Mount Ararat. Now if the story of Noah's Ark was true, you would expect to see kangaroo skeletons gradually increasing as you go south down Africa, and you'd expect to see penguin skeletons in the south of Africa, and you'd expect to see polar bear skeletons in the north of Africa. This simply destroys the story of Noah's Ark, and hence destroys the entire Bible and the concept of Yahweh. So there you go, Shock of God. Proof and evidence that atheism is accurate and correct. Welcome to the world of atheism.